Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Libby Saunier, the CEO of the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children, and I'll be guiding today's discussion on an incredibly important topic, local funding for early childhood education here in Louisiana. We're fortunate to have panel experts with us who are deeply involved in shaping the future of our youngest learners, and I'm excited of the insights we'll learn and gain today. Early childhood education is critical to the development of our children, and we know that adequate funding plays a key role in ensuring quality programs are accessible to all families, especially in underserved communities. Today, we'll focus on how local funding initiatives are supporting early childhood education efforts across Louisiana, the challenges we face, and how we can work together to improve outcomes for all of our children. I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists today, who are wonderful colleagues and friends. Christy Bardell, the Executive Director of the Children's Coalition of Northeast Louisiana, Anna Williamson, Chief Program Officer at Agenda for Children, and Christy Gustafson, I always mess it up, Christy, I'm sorry, CEO of the Community Foundation for Northeast Louisiana. Really what we know is that each of your communities has utilized the local funding strategy to fund early childhood education opportunities in your area. Can you give a quick summary of what strategy or strategies you are currently using to fund early childhood activities? And I'll kick it to you, Christy Bardell, then Christy, and then Anna.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here with you all today and share more about what we're doing to really expand funding around this issue in Northeast Louisiana. And we look at this in threefold. One way that we're really working to increase funding is with our school readiness tax credit, which I'll be able to share more with y'all later on in today's conversation. We also focus a lot around foundations and local funders as well. At Children's Coalition, we're very lucky to work across the life course. So we see the impact that early childhood has into adulthood, parenting, the criminal justice system, and it goes further and further on. And then lastly, really mobilizing grassroots efforts. So we actually have a parent advocacy group and we're operating local coalitions as well. I look forward to sharing more about this with you all today.
So here in the Shreveport-Bossier area of North Louisiana, we put together a steering committee some years ago to figure out exactly how we wanted to tackle the issue of finding more funding for early childhood education. And we decided at the Community Foundation and also as a community that it would be a great use of our time and efficiency to really try to go after those matching dollars from the Louisiana Early Childhood Education Fund. And so what we've done for now 3 years is raise money every year to draw down that match. Our money has been raised almost all philanthropically, and now we're working on a more permanent plan for our area. And I'm happy to say that Shreveport's been up at the top of getting those matching dollars every year since that opportunity has been available. So again, it's mostly been through really just donors reaching in their pocket, but there's a lot of awareness raising that goes around getting those donors to do that.
Absolutely. Anna.
Thank you. So I agree with both of our partners in crime here. I think while we also try to leverage our school readiness tax credits and some other private philanthropy, the biggest strategy that we've been using is drawing down on the early childhood millage that was put into place a couple of years ago in the city of New Orleans. So that is through the form of a property tax. It's 5 mills and it's over the course of 20 years. And because of that, we also, similar to Christy and folks up in Shreveport, we've also been able to receive the state match that she was talking about. And so that is resulting in over $40 million in terms of funding for not only subsidized seat funding for infants and toddlers, but also for our capacity building initiatives, our workforce initiatives, and our quality improvement measures here.
Thanks so much. And another question for all of y'all is really what prompted your community to pursue local funding strategy, and how did state or really federal levels influence your decision? And I'll just let whoever wants to go first.
Okay. Go ahead, Christy.
I can say, so we we were looking at the kindergarten readiness scores and the decrease in kindergarten readiness scores in that sort of 2017, 2018 timeframe as a community and looking for solutions, and became aware of the matching dollars, and really the availability of a dollar for dollar match from the state was hugely attractive to Caddo and Bossier parishes. And we just felt like that was a way to get dollars directly sent to the parishes, along with the tax credit as well, which we also utilize and work closely with NSU, who's the partner that collects that. But it really, the matching dollars were a huge persuasion and still are. I mean, asking somebody, hey, would you give me $25,000 and I'll turn it into 50 is a much easier ask than would you give me $25,000. So.
I'd also, Christy, to add on to what you said is, and I would say this to you for Anna, is in New Orleans coalition really helped think about what do we need more of. And then in the Shreveport Bossier area, your committee of 100 up there, they really stepped up in a big way to help be thought partners in this area too.
Yes, so we did a summit, an early childhood education summit, Community Foundation and an entity then called Step Forward, and brought all of these partners, particularly not only, you know, the mayors of the cities and the sheriffs and the chiefs of police, but all of our business owners, the Committee of 100, the chambers of commerce, to talk about why early brain development is so important. And so what's really cool is, if you stop most committee of 100 members on the street in Shreveport and ask them, you know, what percentage of brain development occurs in the first few years of life, they can tell you now, which is pretty incredible.
You don't even have to stop and ask them, I find. Now they just tell you. So, Christy Bardell, what about you? What were some of the decisions about getting the community to fund some local strategy, and what influenced it, state, local, federal?
So one of the major reasons why we actually shifted around the importance of diversification is that we rely heavily on state and federal funding. We actually operate 5 early Head Start sites in Northeast Louisiana. And we've come to realize, as it's been mentioned earlier in today's sessions, is that it's just that funding shifts from time to time. It's not really necessarily reliable. And even the federal government has admitted that there's underfunding a lot when it comes into early childhood space. So that's why it was so important for us to diversify, because we're really relying on our general funds and our school readiness tax credit funding to support a lot of that work. We're also in the very early stages of discussion around a millage. I know Representative Pat Moore wasn't able to join us today because of legislative session, but really modeling a lot from the fantastic people that's on this panel around how can we really do that friends giving before we do that friends raising before we really do that fundraising, and really move people toward some of these policy initiatives as well, and around that millage also. So we're still in the early steps around a millage, but we're constantly thinking about diversification of funding. How do we begin to diversify that? How do we pull in all of these other legislative bodies? How do we begin to talk to police juries as well? You know, as I mentioned before, we do work across the life course, and we know that there's intersectionality between early education and the justice system too. So how can we even get ourselves on those line item budgets for years to come?
I think that's a really good point about diversification of funding, particularly, you know, at your local area dollars that you might have accessibility to with being able to diversify, but also like at the state level, and then additionally at the federal level. And I think part of the discussion that we all continue to have as colleagues is that it's not one sector's full responsibility to fund an early childhood system. And so when we're talking about police juries and local government, you know, what are different public health dollars? What are, you know, different types of funding? And then with philanthropy dollars, how do we do that? One of the areas that y'all have really shined in, Christy Bardell, is in this area of the school readiness tax credits. So could you share some insights into how school readiness tax credits have really impacted your area in Northeast Louisiana? And what do their successes mean for community engagement?
So I'm proud to say that we actually raised some of the largest amounts of school readiness tax credit dollars in the state. And it's a lot of work. We're actually in school readiness tax credit mode right now, trying to pull in those last minute dollars. And for us, what this has really meant is how really being the glue and the bondage to continue this work. So some of the things that we've had the opportunity to spend school readiness tax credit dollars on or things such as curriculums for schools, looking at required trainings and supporting those health and safety trainings that providers may not have the finances to do. And also, most importantly, ensuring that we have infrastructures in place and continuity of those infrastructures so we can provide early child care support. So I'll share one story with you that really stands out. And one of the things that we've been highlighting as we're on this track to get more school readiness tax credit dollars in 2024. In December of 2022, we actually had a major freeze in North Louisiana. And as a result of this, one of the buildings that we rent from the city of Monroe, the city of West Monroe, actually ended up having significant damage. A water pipe burst. We had to close down the center. Now, granted, we have insurance to support this. However, the insurance, we're fighting back and forth with insurance, and they didn't provide us with enough funds to really reopen this center. So we rolled up our sleeves, Children's Coalition, in partnership with the city of West Monroe, and was like, what is it that we can do? Because we have kids that are displaced, parents that are no longer able to continue their education, they're not able to go to work. And this went on for over 6 months working with the insurance company. So ultimately, we opted to use school readiness tax credit dollars to reopen that space, to extend a contract with the city of West Monroe. So we have sole use of that for 5 years. So now we've given more opportunities to the community. We've helped the workforce, and also the city of West Monroe is even more of a champion of the work that we do. And now they're serving as an advocate for school readiness tax credit dollars in 2024. But that's just one key example. If we didn't have this center may have been closed indefinitely because we talked with the federal government and there wasn't the funds there to reopen it.
And I would say not only West Monroe Chamber an advocate for school readiness tax credit, but a phenomenal advocate for the importance of early care and education and what early childhood education does for their community and the economy. And I think that that's part of the sell here when we talk about local, raising local dollars. How do we do this? Whether it's through the school readiness tax credits or another avenue to think about that. And then I'm about to throw you a question that we didn't write down, but I have great faith in you here. Is that I'm interested for you to be able to share with everybody. How do you use your school readiness tax credits? Because y'all do all types of things within your catchment area, and I think for such a large catchment area similar to Northeast Louisiana, you have to meet different needs at different times.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. So Agenda for Children, as the CCRNR, does serve 11 parishes. So while we often talk about the millage in New Orleans, the team's doing really strong work in 10 other parishes that are very diverse, look very different from New Orleans, and we celebrate that. So what we have just started to implement as our lead agencies in each of those parishes those communities have different needs and they have different interests in what local funding, school readiness tax credit funding could do to support. So what we've tried to do in order to kind of maximize the needs, many of the lead agencies, I would say over the last 2 years, have had similar needs, right? Everything is very workforce related. Everything is, we're all feeling those effects. And so what we've tried to do is put together the opportunity for lead agencies to weigh in to what would mean the most, what would be the biggest bang for buck in their community. And so again, that looks slightly different for each community, but trying to both streamline it from a process standpoint, but allow that local input. And so over the years, it's looked differently for different parishes or different years, depending on what the greatest need is, whether it's more workforce related, whether it's been more curriculum related, manipulatives related, et cetera.
It's just good insight to understand how people use their school readiness tax credits. I was with Fair Shea Perkins last night, and she was sharing they actually raised 20% of the school readiness tax credits for this in the whole state. So a little community raises
Right.
like nearly their goal this year is like $300,000, and what they can do with that is just what is just staggering to think about. And so, Christy, I'm going to go back to you for a minute and just I'm interested from your standpoint, like what are your insights into the credits about maybe barriers that communities face in leveraging those?
So one thing I would say is that a lot of people think it's too good to be true. So I think that you definitely need a supporter. You need an advocate to not only increase awareness around it, but also how can they work with these different businesses to explain to them what the school readiness tax credit dollar is. Because a business is going to trust their CPA more than they trust a third party entity. So for us, it's been key to really leverage those CPA relationships. You know, there is CPA associations across the state of Louisiana. So we make a point to be visible at those meetings. There's required trainings that CPAs have to go to. So really identifying what are those required trainings, being able to have an opportunity maybe to sponsor a luncheon at one of those required trainings, I think is key. Another key component to break down those barriers is really engaging social aid and pleasure clubs like the Kiwanis, engaging the Chamber of Commerce to increase awareness around this work. And lastly, I would say making sure that people see themselves in the school readiness tax credit and in early childhood. I was at a legislative breakfast a couple of months ago, and we were talking about how important it is to invest in early childhood education. There were several representatives around the table that was echoing this. And there was someone that came up to me and was like, hey, you know what, Christy? I definitely want to learn more about it. I've been removed because my child is no longer in early education. And I had to stop and say, hey, you know what? But this impacts you. This person was in the healthcare field. So this is still going to impact you, whether or not whether or not you have a child in the early education space. So really expressing to people the connections that exist with early education and the different business sectors at the table as well.
I think that's such a good point. People are like, well, I don't, my kids are older now. I don't have kids in this space. To your point, it doesn't affect me. And I was like, were you a child? Yes, it affected you. And then you in the workplace, people have, our coworkers have children. And so being able to make those connections are increasingly important because it's all a part of our community that we have to be able to talk about and to be able to say the children are well. And that takes all of us to be able to do that. Christy, for Christy G, because I'm not going to butcher your last name for the 100th time in my life. The Community Foundation really has successfully raised $1 million and more in early childhood education in your area. What has really catalyzed your effort, and what factors contributed to your success? Because y'all have been working excessively hard on this.
Well, I think being a community foundation that's been in existence since the 60s, and being a trusted entity for donations, was an amazing place to start. We were very careful about, so year one, we raised $1 million, and then year two, we raised $3 million. And the first year we put together a steering committee that worked on, how we would spend the dollars for well over a year before we started to raise them. We were really careful about the amount of money that we went out to raise initially to make sure that we would be able to spend the dollars timely and effectively. And so, we have 55 type 3 childcare centers here in Shreveport, which is a major blessing. So we selected just a group of 10 from applicants based on their quality metrics, and then worked with them first and sort of expanded from there. So I think taking it slow, working out all the kinks really helped, because when we went out to say to donors, this is what we did last year, now this is what we're doing this year, they really felt assured that their money would be well spent. Another thing that we did was we hired, and this is another benefit of being a community foundation, we used our own operational dollars to hire an external evaluator for our specific kids here in Caddo Parish. So what we're doing every year, and we've just pulled our 3rd year of data, and it looks fantastic. It's still going in the same direction. So when our kids, with the help of Caddo schools, when our kids go to apply for kindergarten, their caregivers have to answer questions about where they were in school prior to matriculating to kindergarten. And so we have a data analyst. The first 2 years, we had an external data analyst that we pay, and now we've got systems set up, and essentially Caddo is just pulling the data for us, but we actually compare child by child where the child went to school before they got to kindergarten and how they're doing on the kindergarten readiness exam. So if you look at our outcomes, our kids that are at type 3 childcare centers for 3 years running are doing twice as well, if not sometimes more than twice as well on the kindergarten readiness exam than their peers who stay at home. And then what's really awesome is they're keeping up really well with children who are going to private school. And when you consider the demographics of the children that type 3 childcare centers are serving versus the demographics of the kids that are served by the private school, which, kids in poverty, kids not in poverty, the fact that the numbers are pretty close together is really impressive. So I think the combination of being a trusted receptacle for donations and also really measuring our outcomes, relying on really big studies from Johns Hopkins and others, but also pulling together local data to show people literally this is what your dollar is doing has been super, super impactful. So we're going to continue to study that data, and I'd love actually to keep tracking our kids until they get through 3rd grade, 5th grade to see those upticks. That'll be exciting.
Which is so, I mean, that's if you're raising this kind of money, whether it's through philanthropy or a local millage, you want to be able to demonstrate what's happening. And it's just so smart to be able to do that. I think the other piece too, Christy, just to take some thought partnership kudos here for yourself, is like you've been very clear that philanthropy is not sustainable over the long haul. And you have spent some significant time in parish government to talk about how do we do this in a sustainable way. And so, with that, I want to kick it to Anna and say, can you walk us through the process of proposing a millage to increase property taxes for additional childcare seats, and what steps helped gain the taxpayer support? As somebody was in the middle of all that with y'all, it was masterfully done by coalition and in partnership with you all at Agenda for Children.
Sure. Yes, it was definitely not just us. And I'm sorry if I froze for a little bit. I think first and foremost, the community in New Orleans, with both the steering committee and with the provider support and some of our community partners over the last, 5 to 10 years, had really started to truly embrace, understand, and echo the data that we all have and we all believe on this webinar around brain development and the significant importance that having those developmental opportunities at the earliest stages of life. And so I think what had happened is that became a really big talking point and something that was understood, accepted, and celebrated amongst many different coalition members and community partners over the last several years. I think in 2017, we sort of took that interest in that sort of the organization we had as just even as a lead agency and as a Ready Start network to advocate the mayor's office at the time to really support us in creating a pilot program, which would support subsidized seats, provide subsidized seats for 50 infant and toddlers in the new City Seats program. And doing that, through that process, we also uncovered, the data that showed us that while we had 50 that we were serving, we had 8,000 eligible infant and toddlers in the city of New Orleans who really could benefit and could be served if there was capacity and there weren't such funding limitations and capacity limitations in the city. And so we did start to partner with a number of community partners and started to think through the different funding strategies that we could have, and everyone sort of after financial analysis and many conversations and partnership meetings, came to land on the millage opportunity that we were lucky enough to get on the second try. So anyone who's on the webinar who's thinking, oh, if we don't get it the first try, it's not worth going. We all had to kind of regroup, as Libby is very well aware, and try again. There are a lot of obviously technical pieces to getting to actually just starting towards the practical and legal side of getting a millage passed. So there are a lot of things that you have to follow in terms of dates and ensuring that things are a public notice and public meetings. And so we can go deeper into that if no one wants to go to sleep during lunch. However, I would say that the stakeholder meetings and ensuring that the relevant partners were at the table and were providing input was probably the most important thing. So obviously galvanizing and really listening to providers who'd been in the childcare business and industry and sector for a number of years in New Orleans, hearing their input, getting their buy-in, and also engaging with families as well, helping them understand that what a millage means. It sounds very technical. It is very technical, but what are the benefits that both of those two stakeholder groups would get from passing a millage? So that obviously ended up galvanizing a lot of support publicly in terms of campaigning, because it was a true campaign start to finish. And then I think it's also engaging in very specific partnerships who are work very closely with policymakers and helping them understand, both obviously local, city council, mayor, et cetera, helping them understand, whether it was us or Policy Institute and Libby and others, who are really sharing the data and sharing how important it is, not only for our young children to have that access, but for those kids later in life, as Christy Bardell has already said, and as importantly for their families to be able to work, because the majority of our families are out of work. And when they have childcare that they can rely on, and that is quality and safe, they tend to go to work. And so I think it was a lot of just input and ensuring that the right voices were heard over and over and over again.
I think that's a really good point about, parents being able to go to work. And I think, as we think about, you all in Shreveport and in New Orleans and other places where local investments have happened, obviously we want to see what third grade reading levels are and all of those things. But another metric to think about really is about, how does it change your labor participation rate in your local area? What does it look like when a parent is able to have increased educational attainment? And what does it look like to help those families bridge into prosperity, really? And so I think, as we think about the, evaluation and longitudinal work of all this wonderful work that many locals are taking part in, is that there's several factors we need to think about. We need to, obviously, how are the children that have been had access? How are they doing? That's one piece. How are their parents doing? And then how is the community as a whole doing as well? And it's something that we talk about amongst ourselves. And so would really welcome any thought partnership as we're all learning together across the state about what does it look like for local, state, federal investment to really push the envelope to create access. I'm wondering from you, each of you, what are some lessons that you've learned that might help other communities, considering whether it's raising, philanthropic dollars, a millage, how you're using SRTCs? What are some lessons that you think are important to share with people? And I'll kick it to you, Christy Bardell, because you've had a little bit of a rest.
Okay, I actually want to tie that question into a question that was in the chat too, around how do you, in these rural communities or in poverty-stricken parishes where they may not be a tax base, how do you get this money? And I think that's also with the lesson learned. So I would really say it's important for you to understand all of the systems that exist within a particular community, what the tax base is, and also the flow of funding. And I'll give an example. So a prime example is that the police juries get opioid settlement funds. It's up to them to determine where they're going to be providing that opioid settlement funding. The sheriff's office also gets opioid settlement funds. So where you may not have a tax base, where you may not have a civic club, there is police jury. So to me, one of the biggest lessons learned is to really diversify your partnerships, get those unlikely allies, and make partnerships with people that are across different systems. So the judges, the school board members, the interfaith community, because all of them are connected to some extent and they're all within systems.
Thank you. Who else wants to take that? What are some lessons that we've learned?
I would
Christy,
just say, I mean, and I think probably Anna would echo this with the experience that they have with the millage, but going out and asking for funding and from any source, taxpayers or donors or whatever the case is not going to be successful until you raise awareness about why you're need to raise the money in the first place. And so and this was not designed by me. I just happened to be there and in the room at the time, but we designed this summit to start that awareness raising. And really, I spent a good amount of time, probably a year and a half or two, knocking on doors of important decision makers in the community to talk to them about early brain development, and why that was important to them as business owners or as community leaders. And so, I think that is ultimately what allowed us to be able to start raising money in the way that we did. And now, we're sort of in that second phase of, okay, philanthropic dollars are great, but how are we going to do this long term? And so that's another sort of place that we are working to raise awareness right now.
I mean, I think from a millage perspective, there's, it's one of those things where you always think about things in hindsight. So, we are big advocates when others are asking us about kind of suggestions as the lessons learned, to try to build in a planning year, if at all possible, or at least when the campaign starts, build in that time with your campaign, your organizers and your campaign managers and the community very early on, to really think through what this will look like on the grassroots level. What will it look like on the ground? Because you're building a plane while you fly it. I think the other thing that we've learned too is that it helps when your state policymakers are as understand the implications of a millage and understand what that looks like on the ground, both the why, as Christy said, but also the implications it has, the administrative tasks it has, all of that. And I think if you can, while you never think that you're working in silos, I feel that sometimes if you can be closer and better communicative with your state partners, for them to truly understand what that looks like on the ground in that local arena, I think that's also very helpful. The last thing I would say, and this is something that Jen says often, is go big or go home, because the juice is really not worth the squeeze in this type of work if you're talking especially about one of these three different areas. So go big, ask for a lot, expect a lot, and then plan for that implementation.
Thank y'all so much. I'm also wondering from all of your different perspectives, like, what are the first steps you would suggest to other communities considering, when we're talking about raising dollars? Because we often talk about fundraising, but we're not talking about cake sales. We're talking actually about revenue generation. And so, what are some of the first steps that need to be taken when you're thinking about how do you generate revenue versus fundraising? I'll kick us off here. I would say coalitions are very important. And so, Christy G, from your perspective related to coalition, y'all really did that within the business community. And so you teased about it a little bit about what are those first steps, but what were those first steps to get coalition together to be able to get to the spaces you're in now?
Yeah, so we actually pulled a small group of folks together to figure out who needed to be at the table to have that discussion. And then what are our plans to have that discussion? You know, I have read a lot about brain development. I've read a lot about early childhood education, but I am an expert in neither. And so what we did was we brought in folks who were experts in those fields to talk to the people that we invited to the summit. So again, it was like between 60 and 70 community leaders, business owners. You know, we invited a pediatric neurologist. We invited somebody from the Louisiana Department of Education to talk about the structure that the state has set up. We invited some folks from out of the state that had been successful in this regard. So, you know, letting folks hear from experts in their fields about why this is important and why it, you know, it will affect each of them in the room. And it was funny. So we had much debate amongst our planning group about how long people would listen. And I was the ultimate skeptic and said they're not going to pay attention to us for more than 45 minutes. We ended up having a 3 working day session over 3 Fridays in the morning. And held people for several hours, 3 Fridays. And I was shocked at how plugged in and engaged they all were in the process. It was fascinating. It proved me wrong. So I'm delighted that it proved me wrong. But, you know, I think being really intentional about the way that you sort of peeled through the layers of information for your coalitions is really important because obviously the way that we set it up kept them coming back for the next couple of sessions. So that was, you know, super, it couldn't have gone better, really. I was delighted to be proven wrong.
That's wonderful. Anybody else want to add anything related to coalition and how do you start that process?
Oh, I was thinking about the the revenue.
Yeah.
And I do think Christy had said something earlier, Bardell, that was really relevant, right? There are different federal funding streams that might look like they have nothing to do with early childhood, but it's all about how you interpret the law, how it's written, and then how the partnership can happen. So I think Christy was spot on there. And I do think that's always worth looking at, whether it's related to healthcare, juvenile justice, crime, homelessness, you know, the MacArthur kind of line of things. So I do think there are opportunities that might not seem totally obvious, but sometimes they're hidden.
The only other thing I was going to add was that, especially in the coalition space, even when we're talking about this funding and how things are fluctuating and it's really unknown, it's important to have symbiotic relationships. And again, I can't stress it enough to show the linkages and how this really is impacting other people's work and other people's lives, because at the end of the day, that is what is going to be able to allow you to continue to generate that revenue, to look at those unlikely funding streams and continue to grow those unlikely partnerships.
It's a really good point. The other thing I wonder from you all's perspective is like what really is the role around policymakers and how they can help expand funding for early childhood education. You know, if I think Christy G, your legislative delegation in your area, if they see me coming, they know exactly what we want. And they were like, we've already talked to Christy. And I was like, yes, you have, because I probably texted her or she texted me that she was going to talk to y'all. But I mean, from your perspective with the policymakers, like how have they been in partnership with you? And this is for everybody about expanding early childhood education.
So one of the things that we did, and you know, we can't see into the future, so this was great luck. One of the folks that we invited to that early childhood summit in 2018 was Thomas Presley, who is now a member of the Senate, and of the state Senate. And he has been on board with this message since day one. He was really enthusiastic participant at the summit. And he has been a great cheerleader for the work that Caddo Parish is doing all around the state. And so, and in fact, once, particularly our outcome data, wants others to see that local outcome data. So that has been tremendously helpful. And we can't thank him enough for sort of being our cheerleader in that regard. So more to come on that. I mean, we're trying to expand our message, even beyond our area. So
I would echo that about Thomas. If as we think about the special tax reform session that's happening right now, there's some different things at play. I ran into Thomas last night in an event, and he was like, "We're not looking to cut this. It's one thing that's working." And when you talk to Thomas, he's very clear about how that impacts his community, and so then how he talks to other colleagues in the legislature, it's meaningful. And so good job educating him up. And he also has two little people at home that
Yeah.
really, that he knows what an enhanced early ed can do.
Yeah, I mean, what I try to do is stay available to him when he needs data teed up for any reason. And so, I mean, a while ago he was at a session and asked me, texted me at 9 o'clock at night to ask me for some data about something. And I, dug it up for him because he would do the same for us. And so, just that great information share. And, he's such a great partner because he understands exactly how to use outcome data to convince others, to come along. So, just making all of the data that we have access to available, to our legislative partners, I think is really important.
Absolutely. What about from Chris? Go ahead. Well, usually when I see one of them from your area, they're like, Christy just texted us, or I'll text Christy and she's like, I just talked to them. So like that constant communication is increasingly important. And then Anna, I think from your perspective, how have policymakers helped with the expansion of early ed in the greater New Orleans area? Because if I think about a strong delegation, Orleans is a strong delegation that works together.
Yeah. I mean, big kudos to many others, you and others who have helped that be the case. But I think I do think diversifying data for policymakers. So, we said this earlier, but every policymaker tends to have sort of their thing. And so the incredible thing about early childhood and brain development and access to quality early childhood education is that you can link it to so many things that are related to community well-being. And so if you can, like Christy said, get the data and get those outcome pieces, whether it's related to the healthcare piece or the crime piece, et cetera, you tend to have a better ability to get someone to buy in and then be open for the larger piece of the pie in terms of why early childhood is so important. Workforce, of course, as many people, policymakers, drum these days, which can definitely be linked back to having quality and access opportunities for all. I also say, I think our providers in New Orleans, probably like elsewhere, they're very good at saying, I'm so excited to see you, council member. I would love to show you my center. And I think the more you can get, it's sort of that 101, the more you can get policymakers and people in power in a program to see good things happening and to see quality. And again, link that back to all of the other pieces like workforce. It helps policymakers to actually understand more than just a simple view of it. And, I think one thing that we've been very fortunate about, and I think it's taken a lot of just individual conversations, big community events with council members and our mayor. But through that, I think we've really developed trust. And so the more quickly that I think policymakers can start to see those who are on the ground administrating a millage or providers doing the work and listen to families, the more they can see that and really understand it and understand the administrative backbone work, I think that the easier it is. Because you can find yourself completely on defense all the time with policymakers who aren't either up to the task of really understanding the full implications of running an early childhood millage and early childhood programming. So the quicker I think you can develop that trust with them, the better.
Thanks so much, Anna. Christy Bardell, from your perspective, like how has engaging policymakers really helped your efforts with increasing access to early childhood education?
So one thing we did in 2022, we actually did a landscape assessment across all of our parishes to link early childhood to those different social determinants of health. And we pulled upon a lot of statewide and local data. We really pushed policymakers to look at how we're doing in Northeast Louisiana compared to Louisiana, compared to the US, to really put a radar on these are the things that we need to improve in. And I think it's important for us to realize that policymakers are not experts in everything. So that's why it's so important for us to provide them with the data to build that relationship, build that trust, and to humanize them, because ultimately they are the ones who should be pushing for the priorities that we, the constituents, feel are most important. So in our work, we've made sure to invite them to those convenings, share that data with them, have one-on-one conversations to break down that data. Sometimes it can be intimidating when you're in a large forum with experts or other people who are very well versed in this work, and you want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. So I would say ensuring that you're building those relationships, which has been key for us, and it allows policymakers in our area to really come to Children's Coalition and say, hey, you know what? I see y'all as an expert. I want your advice on how to strategize about this. What are your recommendations and how we move forward? And to me, they're going to be lifelong partners because of that work and because of that relationship that we've been intentional in making.
I can't agree more, and to think about, Anna, the point that you made too, about like getting them into centers. And when providers are like, please come in, council member, please come in, rep, please come in, senator. And the thing that we continually hear is when our elected officials are in a quality early learning center, they usually go, oh, this isn't babysitting. And we're like, no, it's not. These early educators are brain architects and meaning and magic makers. And what they're pouring into these children has dividends for a long life to come. And so anytime we can get our elected officials into early learning centers is increasingly important. We work with all of y'all to host Early Ed Month annually, which is in February. When we get elected officials and business leaders there, time and time again, you turn them on to really understand what's happening. A question is if you had unlimited resources, what would be your top funding priority within early childhood education and why? The skies was the limit. What would you do?
Well, I mean, we need more seats in Caddo Parish. I think Bossier Parish probably needs more centers, and we can always raise capacity and quality. So those are, where we would spend our dollars. And I would, when we talk permanence at a foundation, we mean not permanent relative to government permanent. We mean forever, endowment forever. And so that's how I would use dollars to make sure that this is truly, truly permanent, that all kids get to start where they deserve to start, regardless of the neighborhood that they're born in.
Perfect. Thank you, Anna. So you off mute.
I would say quality and capacity. And by capacity, I think, I often say the access train is running way faster than the quality train. For good reason. It's actually much easier to get dollars for seats than it is to sort of develop the people who are interacting with our little ones. And so I think, if we had all the money in the world, I think really creating a very thrivable wage and opportunity for educators. And then along with that, some very, very significant, consistent professional development and programming across the board, so that quality really does catch up to the access train. So when you're putting seats online, they're not only having a safe place to go, they're actually having a safe place where they're really going to develop in all of those different domains.
And that quality piece is so important because we know poor quality is harmful. So we really do want to make sure that the quality piece is there. And how we do that is investing in our early educators, and making sure that they have not just a livable wage, but a competitive wage so that we can retain them too. Christy, from your perspective, if you had all the resources in the world for early ed, what would you focus on?
So when I think of this, I think of the times that I've been in our early Head Start sites. And I think about the parents, the limited resources they have, and frankly, the underpaid staff that we have in early childhood. So I would really lean toward not only the capacity building and development of them, but what are those social supports and programming that they need so they can show up to the classroom. Because so many times I tell my staff, you cannot pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
So how can we look at those individuals in the early childhood space from a whole life perspective in the programming and supports that we're providing to them? So not only are our kids thriving, but our staff are thriving.
Absolutely. You can't give what you don't have. And you have your two most impacted communities are children and the people that care and educate them, that we've got to be able to shore up to be the best that they can. We have two questions in the chat box, and the first one is related to: is there a recent third-party study of the effectiveness and/or participation in SRTC in Louisiana? Also, is there any study showing how many states have now created our SRTC programs related to the school readiness tax credits? I want to say this: Louisiana is the first state in the country to have school readiness tax credits, and since then have been replicated and tweaked in different versions across the country. But I'm not aware of a third-party study. Are you all, related to SRTCs?
Not aware of a third-party study, but when they do ask for participation, the state does receive, they require data from us every year around who's participating, how many people are participating, and the amount of funds that are being provided. So that information is available to share out regarding participation in Louisiana.
Thank you. And the next question we have is: for a person starting out without any business relationships in the area that they live in, what would be some of your initial meeting choices to engage funders? Any ideas, y'all? New business person, who would your initial meetings be with to engage funders or community members or civic engagement?
I might just start hitting the larger civic groups. I mean, anything from like the Rotary Club to the Kiwanis Club to the Junior League. I mean, I can't know everybody in town, but you can create a network that knows everybody in town. So, really just getting to know people and building trust with folks that, if you tell them you're going to do something, you're going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would echo that and say, see if there's a chamber of commerce in your area. There's chambers in pretty much every area. A lot of them list who their membership is online. So it's publicly available usually. And there's opportunities to go to those chamber meetings and not necessarily be a chamber member. So I would say first and foremost, connect with those civic organizations like Christy mentioned, but also explore what chamber opportunities exist within your community.
Yeah, I would also say, not just business, but your local school district. To say, like, you need us to be wildly successful as an early learning center that is a small business. And I say this often: it's not early childhood versus K-12. They're all our babies. and we're dependent on each other to be successful. And so how do we share skin in the game to make sure our little people are ready for success on day one when they enter into kindergarten? And what do those resources look like? Help me, school district, about knowing who to engage with, so that we can show that this is a cohesive, comprehensive system, because we can't have little people just run through like a sieve. In closing, are there any just burning things that either of you would want to share of lessons learned or just inspiration about why engaging in this local funding work is so important?
Well,
can
I mean, I
say-
think we all, oh, go ahead, Christy. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, the other hat that the Community Foundation wears is as a funder of nonprofit services. And, you know, the all over the country and nonprofit services, are seeing and trying to move towards proactive measures that effectively change community. Obviously, we have to have, things that we call reactive philanthropy, we have to provide services for folks that are unhoused. We have to provide services for folks that need a hot meal. We have to make sure that, kids who don't have supplies and uniforms, all those kind of needs are met. But we're not going to change the numbers of folks in poverty in our community without making really large proactive measures. That, I think it was Anna that said, go big or go home. That is absolutely how I feel about it. Now's the time, because in order to see that change, it's going to take 15 or 20 years plus, right? So I keep thinking about it like we got 60% of kindergarten students that are not ready. What if it was only 40? Imagine the impact that would have on our community, on parents, caregivers, employers, employees, poverty numbers, everything. Juvenile justice, criminal justice, all of these things are affected. We know they're all correlated. And so proactivity is, what has to happen to create real effective change.
And add onto that, it's a two-gen approach when we think about early childhood education, because we're getting families in the workforce now, we're getting them educated now, and then their little people can go through the system at a rate of all the things that Christy just shared. So absolutely. Anna, what did you want to share?
Christy just summed it up beautifully. I truly do think everything is correlated, and I think you can always, I will say, while it feels very urgent, this is something that we've talked about too internally here, more specific maybe to the millage, but while it feels very urgent, it needs to be extremely strategic and not tactical, which I think, given the urgency and given how tides change when it comes to funding, it can feel very scarcity mindset, feast or famine. And so I think it's also just extremely important to realize not only is all of this coordinated and there's such a need to act, but there's a need to act in really strategic, thoughtful ways, and with community and not at community.
Absolutely. And if not now, then when? Because we could wait another 20 years and still be in the same spot. Christy Bardell, any closing thoughts from you?
Two things. One, I think when I think of local level and local funding, I think that's more attainable. This is where y'all all live. You can relate, you have connections, you can build those connections, and it drives what happens at the state and federal level. So while you may not be doing it now, it is one of those low-hanging fruits that is attainable. The second thing I want to share is that it's so important to look, as I mentioned before, the intersectionality between systems. This is not a time to be a crab in a barrel type mentality. We can all win, but we can only win when we work together, and you see the interconnectedness between the work that we do.
Absolutely. It is not us and them. It is all of us for our babies and our families. Thank you all for joining us today. Christy, and Anna, like some of my favorite people to be thought partners with. Your valuable insights, I'm sure, reached everybody who was with us. As we wrap up, I encourage everyone to continue the conversation after this panel, whether it's through networking, sharing resources, or collaborating on local initiatives. We know that together we can continue to make the difference in the lives of children and families in our state. Thank you again to our panelists and to everyone for being in today's discussion. Before we wrap up, I want to remind everyone that the next session will begin at 1:05. So enjoy the rest of your day, the next session, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you all.